"I just think it's a little funny," she said, not quite to him, not quite to herself, tilting her wine glass toward the candlelight like she was inspecting it for flaws. "That Bree thought we'd have things in common." The man across the table didn't flinch, didn't look away, didn't reach for his water or straighten his napkin or do any of the small, panicked things people do when they've just been dismissed in public. He just looked at her, steady, unhurried. The way a man looks at a storm he's already decided isn't his problem. The couple at the next table heard it. The waiter refilling the bread basket heard it. Everyone within 6 feet of Osteria Reina's corner section heard it, and the silence that followed had that particular texture of a room holding its breath. He was a hospital janitor. She was a CEO. And she'd just made sure the entire restaurant knew exactly what she thought about that gap. "Drop a comment right now. Tell me where you're watching from. Because what happens next in this restaurant is something I promise you've never seen on a blind date before, and you need to stay for every second of it." Callum Reyes had worked the early shift at Crescent General that morning. 6 a.m. start, 3rd floor surgical wing, the kind of work that leaves a specific smell on your clothes, antiseptic and floor wax, and the particular staleness of recycled hospital air. He'd gone home, showered, made Mara her afternoon snack, checked her inhaler twice, and then stood in front of the mirror in his bedroom for approximately 45 seconds before deciding the blazer was fine and leaving. He hadn't wanted to come. Not because he was nervous. Nervousness required a certain investment in outcome, and he'd learned, over the past 3 years, to keep his investments small. He'd come because Bree had asked him 4 times across 3 weeks, and because Mara had said go, "Baba, you're boring when you stay home," and because some quiet part of him that still believed in ordinary things had thought, just briefly, why not? He'd clipped his kit to the inside of his bag before leaving. He always did. Mara's asthma had a way of announcing itself without warning, and he'd learned long before he became her father, in circumstances he didn't discuss over dinner, that the distance between a manageable situation and a catastrophic one was usually about 90 seconds and whatever you happened to be carrying. The kit was small. A soft-sided black case, no larger than a paperback novel. Inside, an epinephrine auto-injector, a compact airway kit, trauma dressing, nitrile gloves, a short list of items that most people would not recognize by name and would not know how to use. He'd repacked it that afternoon out of habit, checking each item the way other men check their wallet and keys. The maitre d' at Osteria Reina had looked at the bag when he arrived, had, in fact, reached for it with the practiced authority of someone accustomed to checking coats and managing the visual tidiness of an upscale dining room. Callum had said, quietly and without apology, that he'd prefer to keep it at the table. The maitre d' had assessed him, the worn blazer, the calm that didn't quite fit the context, and decided, for reasons he couldn't have articulated, not to push. So the bag sat beside Callum's chair as Nadia Voss told the room what she thought of him. And he sat with the particular stillness of a man who has been in rooms where stillness kept people alive. And he looked at her, and he thought, not with anger, not with the hot, immediate hurt that the moment probably deserved. He just thought, one more exchange, then I'll leave. He reached for his water. Across the table, Nadia set her wine glass down and turned slightly toward the room, the way people do when they've already moved on from a conversation, already filed it, already forgotten it. Her posture said, "This is over." Her expression said, It was never really anything. She had built a company from $40,000 and a second-hand laptop. She had restructured 4 failing hospital networks across 2 countries. She had sat across from men 3 times her size in boardrooms designed to make her feel small, and she had not blinked once. She had never, in 41 years, been in a room where the most important person was the one no one was looking at. That was about to change. She reached for her wine again. Her fingers closed around the stem, and then she stopped. Her fingers were still wrapped around the stem of the glass when she set it down again. Not a choice, exactly. More like a hesitation her body made before her mind caught up with it. She pressed 2 fingers to the base of her throat, a small, private gesture, almost thoughtful, like she was trying to remember something just out of reach. Callum noticed. He noticed because noticing was something his nervous system had been trained to do long before it became habit. The slight shift in breathing, the hand going to the throat, the way a person's face changes when the body starts sending signals the brain hasn't processed yet. He noticed, and then he looked away, because it was probably nothing. People touch their throats at dinner tables. It didn't mean anything. Nadia picked up her fork. The restaurant moved around them the way restaurants do. The low orchestration of other people's evenings, cutlery against ceramic, someone laughing too loudly near the bar, a waiter navigating the narrow corridor between tables with the focused grace of someone who'd done it 10,000 times. The candle between them threw soft light across the white tablecloth and made everything look more intimate than it was. "So," Nadia said, and her voice had the particular quality of someone restarting a conversation they've already decided the outcome of. "How long have you been at the hospital?" 3 years, Callum said. She nodded, the way people nod when they're not listening. Her eyes moved briefly to the couple at the next table, the ones who'd heard her comment, and then back to him, and there was something in her expression that might have been, in a different person, the beginning of discomfort. "And before that?" He looked at her for a moment. "Different work," he said. She waited for him to continue. He didn't. Another small recalibration crossed her face. She was accustomed to people filling silence when she created it. And then she reached for her wine again, this time lifting it fully, taking a small sip. She swallowed, touched her throat again. This time the gesture lasted longer. 3 miles away, in a flat above a dry cleaner on Mercer Street, Mara Reyes was explaining to Briseis Okafor why the stuffed rabbit she'd named Captain had to sleep on the left side of the bed and not the right, because the right side was where Mama used to sit, and Captain wasn't Mama. And those were simply the rules. Bree, who had heard the Captain protocol approximately 11 times and had never once challenged it, tucked the rabbit in with the same seriousness the situation demanded. "Is Baba going to like her?" Mara asked. "I don't know yet, baby." "Does she know about his kit?" Bree looked at her. 7 years old, this child, with her father's eyes and her mother's absolute lack of interest in softening a question. "No," Bree said. "She doesn't know about the kit." Mara considered this with the gravity of a small person sitting with important information. "She should probably know about the kit," she said finally, and pulled the blanket up to her chin. Bree turned the lamp down and stood in the doorway for a moment, looking at her. She'd known Callum for 3 years. She'd watched him mop floors in the same corridors where, if the world had been even slightly more just, he'd have been scrubbing in for surgery. She'd seen the way the other nurses talked around him, not unkindly, just obliviously, and she'd watched him absorb it with a patience she'd always found more painful to witness than any amount of anger would have been. She'd thought Nadia would be different. She'd been wrong about that before. Her phone buzzed. She looked at it. Nothing from Callum, which meant one of two things. It was going well, or it was going badly enough that he'd already gone quiet in the way he went quiet when something had settled in him, and he was just waiting to be somewhere else. She put the phone away. If you've ever rooted for someone who carries their whole life quietly in a bag no one bothers to ask about, you already know where this story is going. Subscribe and keep the bell on, because part 3 is where the mask comes all the way off, and what's underneath it changes everything. Back at Osteria Rain, the waiter arrived with their main course. Nadia did not look at her plate. Her hand was at her throat again, and this time it wasn't a gesture. It was a grip, 2 fingers pressing in, and her breathing, when it came, arrived with a sound that didn't belong in a restaurant, thin and effortful and wrong. And Callum, who had already looked away twice, looked back. The sound came again, thinner this time, a pulled, reedy rasp that cut through the ambient noise of the restaurant the way a wrong note cuts through music. Not loud, just unmistakably out of place. The woman at the adjacent table heard it first and looked over. Then the waiter, who'd just set down their plates, froze, a bowl of risotto still in his hand, his professional composure momentarily abandoning him. Nadia's fingers were pressed flat against her throat now. Her eyes, composed all evening, calibrated, in control, had gone somewhere else entirely. They were wide and inward-looking, the eyes of someone listening to their own body with growing alarm, hearing something they didn't have language for yet. "Something's wrong," she said. Her voice was strange, compressed, like she was speaking through a door that was slowly closing. Callum was already out of his chair, not dramatically, not with the shoved-back, clattering urgency of someone performing a response, just up, smoothly, the way a person moves when movement is the only logical next step. He came around the table and crouched in front of her, putting his eyes level with hers, and what she saw in his face was not panic, not the mirroring fear she might have expected. It was focus, clean and absolute, the expression of someone who had already begun working the problem. "Look at me," he said quietly. "Can you tell me what you ate today? Anything different, shellfish, nuts, anything you don't usually have?" Her lips were swelling. Visibly, quickly, the soft tissue responding to something with the indifferent efficiency of a body doing exactly what it was built to do. She touched her mouth with 2 fingers, felt the change, and the fear in her eyes sharpened into something specific. "Shellfish," she managed. I have a sensitivity, but I've never—" "Shared fryer," Callum said, more to himself than to her. He'd seen the menu. The calamari listed 3 items above her sea base. "Okay, I need you to stay upright. Don't let anyone lay you flat. Can you do that?" She nodded. One sharp movement, and he could see she was fighting to stay present, fighting the body's instinct to fold. Behind him, the restaurant had found its voice. Someone near the bar shouted for a doctor. A waiter was already on the phone, his words clipped and urgent. "Anaphylaxis, we think. Yes, she's conscious." And the manager had materialized from somewhere near the back, standing in the middle of the dining room with the particular helplessness of a man whose training had not covered this. 3 tables away, A man in a dark suit rose from his chair with the careful, deliberate movement of someone deciding to act. He was tall, silver-haired, the kind of face that commanded rooms without effort. Dr. Fenwick Lau, cardiologist. 63 years old, 35 of them in medicine, and currently calculating, with the cold precision of someone who knows their own limits, that he had not managed an acute airway emergency since a rotation in 1994. He moved toward them anyway, because he was the only person in the room with any medical training at all, and that had to count for something. Callum had already unclipped the kit. He did it without looking at the bag, his hands finding the zip by memory, pulling the soft case open on the floor beside Nadia's chair. The nitrile gloves went on in 2 practiced movements. The epinephrine auto-injector was in his right hand, before Lau had covered half the distance between their tables. "Is she allergic to epinephrine?" he asked her, direct and low. "No." Her voice was barely a whisper now. The airway narrowing was audible, a thin, frightening pull of breath that made the couple at the adjacent table go pale. He administered the injection with the unhurried precision of someone who had done this in the back of a moving vehicle, in a forward operating base at 2 in the morning, in conditions that made a candlelit restaurant look like an operating theater. Clean angle, correct sight, steady pressure, done. Then he positioned her, upright, supported, her airway aligned, and placed one hand lightly on her back and began to talk her through her breathing, not with alarm, with cadence. A specific, measured rhythm he'd learned in a valley 8,000 kilometers away, when panic was the thing most likely to finish what the injury had started. "Breathe with me. In, 2, 3, out, 2, 3. Don't fight it. Just follow." Dr. Lau arrived at his shoulder and stopped. He looked at the kit. He looked at Callum's hands. He looked at the way Nadia's breathing was already, impossibly against every expectation of the last 90 seconds, beginning to slow, and he said nothing. Lau stood at Callum's shoulder and did not move. Not because he was frozen, he told himself, in the 3 seconds it took him to cross the restaurant, that he would not freeze, that 35 years in medicine meant something, that his hands still knew things. But what his hands knew was the careful, instrument-assisted work of a catheterization lab. What they knew was chest pain and blocked arteries and the specific choreography of a cardiac unit at full staff. What they did not know, not anymore, not with any confidence he'd stake a life on, was this. And the man crouched in front of Nadia Voss clearly did. Callum wasn't thinking about Lau. He wasn't thinking about the restaurant, or the watching faces, or the fact that 20 minutes ago the woman in front of him had told the room what she thought of him. He was thinking about her airway. He was thinking about the epinephrine's timeline. 90 seconds to peak effect, secondary swelling still possible, laryngeal involvement a real and present risk. He was thinking about what he'd do if the first injection wasn't enough, and whether the restaurant's ambient temperature was working for them or against them. He was thinking the way he'd been trained to think, narrow, sequential, one decision at a time. "Stay with me," he said to her, eyes open, keep following the breath. Nadia was looking at him with an expression he couldn't fully categorize. Fear still present, but something else beneath it now, something that was trying to orient itself, trying to find purchase. She was a woman accustomed to reading rooms, reading people, making rapid assessments of who had power and who didn't. Every instinct she'd spent 41 years sharpening was currently pointed at the man in front of her, and every one of them was saying the same thing. This person knows exactly what he's doing. Her lips were still swollen. Her breathing was thin but rhythmic now, following the pattern he'd given her with a discipline that surprised him. She was frightened, genuinely, perhaps more frightened than she'd been in years, but she was not panicking, and that was keeping her alive as much as the epinephrine was. "The ambulance," Callum said without turning around. He said it to whoever was behind him, the manager, a waiter, anyone. 6 minutes, someone said. The manager. His voice was barely steady. Callum nodded once. 6 minutes was manageable. 6 minutes was fine. He'd held worse situations together for longer than 6 minutes with less than he was currently carrying. Lau crouched down beside him finally, his expensive jacket pulling at the shoulders. "I'm a cardiologist," he said, low enough that it didn't carry. "Lau, I can assist if—" "Her airway's partially compromised," Callum said. "Same volume, same register. Not a conversation so much as a handoff of information. Epinephrine administered 90 seconds ago, correct site and dose. She's responsive and following commands. Secondary swelling is the risk. If her voice changes or the stridor gets worse before the ambulance arrives, tell me immediately." Lau absorbed this, looked at Nadia, looked at the kit open on the floor, the airway roll, the trauma dressing, the organized interior of a case that had clearly been packed by someone who knew what each item was for. He'd seen medical kits before. He'd seen the kits paramedics carried, the kits kept behind nursing stations, the grab bags in emergency departments. He had not seen one like this at a dinner table. "You've done this before," he said, not a question. Callum didn't answer. He was watching Nadia's throat, specifically the small visible pulse at its base, the movement of air, the color staying in her face. The epinephrine was working. Her breathing had loosened from that terrifying, reedy pull into something shallower but more consistent. The worst of it had plateaued. Around them, the restaurant had gone almost completely still. The music, which had been playing quietly all evening, was still playing. Something low and instrumental, surreally calm. And against that backdrop, the watching faces had arranged themselves into a tableau that would stay with several of the people present for a long time afterward. The woman at the adjacent table, the one who'd heard the comment about the janitor, who'd exchanged a look with her husband at the precise moment Nadia had laughed, was watching Callum's hands with an expression that had moved well past surprise into something quieter and more complicated. She recognized competence. She recognized the specific quality of a person doing exactly what they were made for. She just never expected to see it here. From somewhere outside, carried through the restaurant's glass front, the first faint wail of a siren began threading through the city noise, still distant but growing. 4 minutes. Callum stayed exactly where he was. The siren grew. Not close enough yet. Still 2, maybe 3 minutes of city. Traffic between the ambulance and the front door of Osteria Rain. But present now, a fixed point of sound in what had become a very quiet room. Someone near the bar had turned the music off. No one had asked them to. It had just seemed, instinctively, like the right thing to do. Callum kept his hand on Nadia's back. The contact was clinical, positioned specifically to monitor the movement of her ribcage, the depth and consistency of each breath. But it was also steadying, and she had leaned into it slightly, barely perceptibly, the way people lean toward warmth without meaning to. her color was better. That was the clearest indicator. The gray-white pallor that had overtaken her face in the first 90 seconds had pulled back, and underneath it was the specific flush of a body fighting hard and beginning, cautiously, to win. Her lips were still swollen. Her breathing was still audible. But the stridor, that thin, catastrophic narrowing sound, had softened into something that was frightening but no longer immediately life-ending. "The swelling's stabilizing," Callum said to Lau, who was still crouched beside him, close enough to be useful, disciplined enough not to interfere. Lau nodded. He had his fingers lightly at Nadia's wrist, pulse monitoring, the one contribution he could make with confidence. And he was watching Callum the way a student watches a teacher, which was not an experience he'd had in approximately 25 years, and which was doing something uncomfortable to his understanding of this evening. "Rate?" Callum asked. "Elevated but regular, 108. Expected, it'll come down." He said it the way people state facts, not to reassure, not to perform confidence, just because it was true, and true things were worth saying. Nadia was listening. This was not a small thing. She was frightened, and her throat still felt like it was wrapped in something too tight, and the edges of her vision had gone briefly strange, in a way she wasn't going to think about until later. But she was listening, because listening was apparently what her body had decided to do when everything else was temporarily unavailable to it. She heard the exchange between the two men, heard the shorthand of it, the economy, the way information moved between them without friction. She heard Lau, Dr. Lau, she would learn his name later, a cardiologist with 35 years and a reputation she would in fact recognize. Defer. Simply and without performance, defer. To the man she had laughed about. She had built her entire career on the ability to read a room, to know within minutes of entering a space where the real competence lived and where it was merely costumed. She had been wrong before. She was not so arrogant as to pretend otherwise. But she was rarely wrong like this. She was rarely wrong in a direction this significant, this visible, this witnessed. The woman she'd been an hour ago would have found a way to reframe it, would have located, somewhere in the available facts, an interpretation that kept her original assessment mostly intact. That was what she did. That was what she'd always done. The woman currently breathing in careful measured counts, following the rhythm of a voice that was keeping her airway open, did not have access to that version of herself. All she had was what was directly in front of her, the kit on the floor, the gloves, the hands that knew exactly where to be, and the face when she could focus on it, not angry, not satisfied, not performing any of the things she might have performed in his position, just present, completely, entirely present. She thought about what she'd said, heard it again in the specific way you hear things when your body has recently reminded you it can be taken from you without notice. Funny that Bree thought we'd have things in common. The tilt of the glass, the half turn away. She closed her eyes briefly, opened them, kept breathing. If you've ever misjudged someone so completely that it rearranged something in you, stay with this story, because what's coming in the next few parts will make you feel every bit of that. Subscribe and hit the bell so you don't miss the moment this restaurant full of witnesses finally understands exactly who they've been looking at all evening. Outside, the siren was no longer growing. It had arrived. A wash of red and white light beginning to pulse through the restaurant's front glass, striping the walls, the tablecloths, the watching faces. The ambulance was here, and Nadia Voss, CEO, founder, the woman who'd arranged herself at the top of every room she'd ever entered, was sitting upright in a restaurant chair because a man she'd dismissed was refusing to let her fall. The ambulance doors closed. The red and white light that had been striping the restaurant walls pulled away from the curb and dissolved into the city's ordinary illumination. And Osteria Reina was left with the specific silence of a space that has just witnessed something it wasn't designed for. A few guests had already gathered their coats and left, quietly, without making a production of it. The way people exit when they've been reminded that an evening out is not, in the final accounting, a particularly serious thing. Others stayed, sat with their unfinished meals and their unfinished conversations, not quite ready to return to whatever they'd been talking about before. Callum stood near the table where it had happened and looked at the space Nadia had occupied, the chair, the overturned water glass that no one had righted yet, the untouched plate of sea bass the kitchen had sent out at exactly the wrong moment, and felt the particular stillness that followed adrenaline when it receded. Not emptiness, just the body returning to itself, reclaiming its ordinary rhythms, filing the last 30 minutes into the part of memory reserved for things that were real and would stay real. He knew this feeling well. He'd felt it in a different country, in a different life, standing outside a field tent after something had either gone right or gone wrong. And the difference between those two outcomes had been measured in seconds and whatever he'd happened to be carrying. The feeling was the same regardless of outcome, this specific, leveling return to the ordinary. He'd never found a word for it in English. There was one in Urdu his mother used, sukoon, that came close. A settling, a restoration of quiet after turbulence. He picked up his jacket from the back of his chair. 3 years earlier, in a waiting room on the second floor of Crescent General, a doctor had explained what happened to Sana using words that were accurate and considered and organized in the specific way medical language organizes itself around difficult information. Building toward the conclusion carefully, surrounding it with context, as though the architecture of the explanation might soften the structure of the fact. It hadn't. Sana Reyes had gone in for a procedure that was, by every metric available, routine. She had been healthy and 42 and laughing about something on her phone in the pre-op bay when Callum had kissed her forehead and let the nurse guide him to the waiting room. 4 hours later, a doctor was explaining that an administrative error, a medication chart misread, a dosage unchecked, the catastrophic arithmetic of a system that had moved too fast through one too many handoffs, had led to a complication that should never have occurred. She had not woken up. Mara had been 4 years old and had asked for her mother every day for 6 months with the relentless, heartbreaking persistence of a child who has not yet learned that some questions stop having answers. Callum had answered her every time. He had not known what else to do. He had made her breakfast and checked her inhaler and walked her to the park and answered her every time, because being present was the only thing he had that was still entirely his to give. He had resigned from every medical affiliation within a week of Sana's death. Not dramatically, no speech, no confrontation, just the quiet removal of himself from a world he could no longer inhabit without the anger consuming him entirely. He had not trusted himself near the machinery of medicine, near the systems and hierarchies and handoffs that had taken her. He had needed distance. He had needed somewhere to put himself that was useful and simple, and did not require him to trust anything more complicated than a mop and a schedule. Crescent General had been hiring. He had understood, applying, that there was something not entirely rational about returning to the building where it had happened. He had also understood, in the way you understand things that live below the reach of language, that he couldn't leave it entirely, that some part of him needed to remain in proximity to the place, needed to be present in those corridors in whatever capacity available, as though his being there was a form of witness the building owed Sana and that he was collecting on her behalf. He mopped the floors. He checked the fire exits. He reordered the supply cupboard on the third floor that everyone forgot about until they needed it. He carried his kit. And tonight, in a restaurant he'd almost left before any of it began, the kit had mattered in the way he'd always quietly, privately believed it would someday matter again. He straightened his jacket. Behind him, the chair was still pulled from the table at its emergency angle. He reached out and pushed it gently back into place. The paramedics came through the door the way paramedics always do, purposeful, load-bearing, carrying the specific authority of people who have walked into the worst moments of strangers' lives so many times it has become simply their posture. Two of them, a woman in her 30s with close-cropped hair and the unhurried efficiency of someone who'd seen everything, and a younger man behind her already scanning the room, already identifying the table, already moving. The restaurant parted for them without being asked. Callum stayed where he was until they reached him, and then he did something that would stay with several people in that room long after the evening had dissolved into memory and retelling. He did not step back. He did not yield the space the way a bystander yields, the relieved surrender of someone handing off a problem they were never equipped to handle. He completed his handoff the way a professional transfers care, concise, sequential, nothing omitted. Female, 41, anaphylaxis. Suspected trigger is shellfish via shared fryer contamination, he said, already peeling the gloves. Epinephrine administered at, he checked his watch, 9 minutes ago, correct site, standard dose. Airway was critically compromised at onset, partial. Resolution post-injection, stridor has reduced but not cleared. Secondary laryngeal swelling remains a risk. She's been upright and responsive throughout. No loss of consciousness. The senior paramedic was already kneeling, already working, but she looked up at him once, a quick, assessing look, and said, "You a medic?" "I was," Callum said. He stepped back. The younger paramedic had the stretcher unfolded, the oxygen mask ready, his movements interlocking with his partner's in the seamless way of people who had trained together long enough that communication had become mostly unnecessary. They were good. Watching them work, Callum felt the particular mix of recognition and distance that came from seeing your former world functioning without you, competent, necessary, entirely indifferent to your absence from it. He picked up the kit from the floor, began repacking it, epinephrine casing into the left pocket, gloves into the disposal sleeve, the airway roll back into its slot, careful, the way you treat tools you might need again soon. It was the repacking that did it. The woman at the adjacent table, she'd been watching all of it, this whole time, her dinner untouched, her husband's hand found and held at some point during the last 10 minutes without either of them registering the moment it happened. She watched Callum repack the kit with the focused, methodical attention of someone who did this regularly, who cared about the order of it, who understood that the state you left your tools in was a reflection of what you thought the next emergency deserved. She turned to her husband, said something very quietly. He nodded. Across the room, Dr. Lau had straightened up. He was standing slightly apart from the activity around Nadia's table, his jacket still pulled wrong at the shoulders from when he'd crouched, and he was watching Callum in a way that had moved past assessment into something more considered. He was a man who had spent his career in rooms that sorted people quickly, medical school, residencies, hospital hierarchies that were brutal in their clarity about who belonged where. He knew competence the way a musician knows pitch, not as a judgment, just as a fact you couldn't unhear once you'd heard it. What he'd watched in the last 10 minutes was not the performance of someone with first aid training and a lucky kit. It was clinical decision-making under pressure, executed with a precision that did not come from a course or a certificate. It came from repetition. It came from having done this in conditions where getting it wrong meant someone didn't come home. He walked over. Callum was still crouching, kit almost repacked, and he looked up when Lau's shadow crossed him. "Lau," the older man said. He extended his hand. "Fenwick Lau, cardiology, St. Benedict's." Callum looked at the hand for a beat, then took it. "Callum, where did you train?" The restaurant was still operating around them in a muted, rearranged way. Guests who hadn't left were speaking in low voices, staff moving carefully, the stretched-out aftermath of crisis settling into the room like dust after an impact. The stretcher was being guided toward the door. Nadia was on it, oxygen mask in place, one hand gripping the rail with the white-knuckled determination of a woman who did not intend to appear frightened even when she was. As they passed, her eyes found Callum. He was still crouched on the floor, kit in his hands, looking up at her. The eye contact lasted 4 seconds. She didn't look away first. She was gone before he stood up. The restaurant doors swung shut behind the stretcher, and the paramedics and the particular energy that emergency carries with it, that compressed, forward-leaning urgency, and what remained was the ordinary air of an interrupted evening, suddenly very aware of itself. Callum rose from the floor, clipped the kit back to the inside of his bag, straightened his jacket, the worn blazer, the one he'd decided was fine 45 minutes ago in a mirror 3 miles away, and stood for a moment in the space where all of it had happened. The overturned water glass, the untouched plates, the chair where she'd been sitting, slightly pulled from the table at an angle that still held the shape of emergency. Lau was still beside him, waiting for an answer to a question Callum hadn't responded to yet. "Pakistani Army," Callum said finally, reaching for his own water glass, finding it empty. 8 years, forward trauma medicine. Lau was quiet for a moment. The kind of quiet that isn't absence of response, but presence of it. A man taking something in and giving it the weight it deserved. "Forward posting?" he asked. "Swat Valley, 2 rotations in the north, 1 attachment with a UN field unit." He set the glass down. "A long time ago." "Not that long," Lau said. "What you just did, the assessment, the positioning, the dosage decision under those conditions, that's not something that leaves you." He paused. "You work at Crescent General?" "I do." Another pause. Shorter this time, but with a different quality. "In what capacity?" Callum looked at him. There was no challenge in the look, no defensiveness, no performance of any kind. He'd been asked the question 100 times in 3 years, and he'd answered it the same way each time, because it was simply true, and he'd made his peace with what that truth looked like from the outside. "Mostly." "Janitorial services," he said. "3rd floor surgical." Lau held his gaze, did not look away, did not rearrange his expression into something careful or diplomatic. He just looked at Callum for a long moment with the directness of a man recalibrating something important, and then he said, very quietly, "I wouldn't have been fast enough tonight." He said it the way doctors rarely say things, without qualification, without the protective grammar of clinical distance. Just the plain fact of it, spoken to the one person in the room who would understand exactly what it cost to say. Callum nodded once, accepted it the way it was offered, not as a compliment, not as a transfer of guilt, just as the truth between two people who both understood what the alternative would have looked like. The woman from the adjacent table appeared at his elbow. She was perhaps 50, composed in the way of someone who had collected herself deliberately, and she had the particular expression of a person who has decided to say something and is going to say it regardless of whether it comes out exactly right. "I heard what she said," the woman said. "Before, what she said about you." She stopped, started again. "I just wanted you to know that I think everyone here." "It's all right," Callum said. "It isn't," she said, with a firmness that surprised them both. He looked at her. She held her ground, this woman, and something in him recognized the specific courage of that. The decision to name a thing when silence would have been easier and no one would have blamed you for choosing it. "No," he agreed after a moment. "It isn't." He said it without heat, without satisfaction. Just the same plain acknowledgement he'd given Lau. "But it's all right." He picked up his bag, checked his phone, 2 messages from Bree, one asking how it was going, one sent 11 minutes later asking if everything was okay because she'd had a feeling. He typed back, "Everything's fine. I'll explain tomorrow. Mara, okay?" The response came in seconds. "Sound asleep. Captain is on the correct side." "What happened?" He smiled at that, briefly, privately. "Put the phone away. If you've ever been the person in the room that everyone looked past, right up until the moment they desperately needed you, then you already understand what Callum carried out of that restaurant. Subscribe and keep the bell on. Because the next part is where this story stops being about one dinner and becomes about something much larger than either of them expected. He left a tip on the table. Generous. More than the meal had cost him. Nodded once to the manager, who was standing near the door looking like a man who intended to tell this story for the rest of his life. Then Callum Reyes walked out into the night, and the city received him the way it always had, without noticing. The night was cold in the specific way autumn nights are cold in this city. Not brutal, just honest. The kind of temperature that makes you aware of your own face and the distance between where you are and where you're going. Callum walked. He didn't take the direct route home. He rarely did after something had happened, after a shift that had gone sideways, after one of Mara's bad nights with the inhaler, after any of the days that left something residual in him that needed movement to metabolize. The city at this hour had a different quality to it, emptier, more itself, the performance of daytime stripped away and replaced with something quieter and more honest that he'd always found easier to be inside. He passed a pharmacy, a shuttered dry cleaner, a late-night bakery exhaling warm air and the smell of something with cardamom in it, which was close enough to his mother's kitchen that he slowed for 3 steps without meaning to. He thought about Nadia, not about what she'd said, that had already moved to the part of him where things were filed rather than felt, the interior cabinet he'd built over years of being invisible in rooms that didn't think to look at him. He thought about her face on the stretcher, the oxygen mask, the hand gripping the rail, the 4 seconds of eye contact as they'd wheeled her past. He thought about what it cost a person like her to be seen like that, reduced, dependent, breathing on a borrowed rhythm in front of a room full of witnesses who had all, in the space of 10 minutes, understood something about her that she'd spent decades carefully managing. He didn't feel satisfaction about that. He'd examined himself for it on the walk, turned the feeling over looking for that particular edge, and it wasn't there. What was there was something more complicated and less convenient, a kind of recognition he hadn't expected and didn't entirely welcome. She'd been frightened, genuinely, strippedly frightened, in the way that only happens when the body overrules everything the mind has spent years constructing. He knew what that felt like. He'd felt it once in a hospital corridor that he now mopped on Tuesday and Thursday mornings, standing in a family waiting room while a doctor explained what had happened to Sana in language that was careful and correct and changed absolutely nothing about the outcome. His phone buzzed. Bree again. "Callum, what happened? Full sentences, please." He typed back. "She had an anaphylactic reaction. I had the kit. She's stable." A pause. Then, "She's going to be fine." 3 dots appeared, disappeared, appeared again. Then, "Of course you did. Of course you had the kit." Another pause. "Are you fine?" He considered this for half a block. The question was simple, and Bree had always had the particular gift of asking the simple question that turned out to be the complicated one. "Yeah," he typed. "I think so." He meant it mostly. At St. Aurelius Hospital, 2 kilometers east, a different building than Crescent General, smaller and quieter, Nadia was being assessed in a curtained bay in the emergency department. The secondary swelling had not progressed. The epinephrine had held. Her airway was clear, her vitals stabilizing, and the attending physician, a tired, competent woman who had started her shift 6 hours ago, was explaining that she'd need to stay for observation and would be prescribed a carry kit on discharge. "An EpiPen," the doctor said. "You need to have it with you at all times. Given tonight's severity, you should assume future exposures will be at least as serious." Nadia nodded. She was sitting up on the narrow hospital bed, her hair loose now from its arrangement, her jacket folded on the chair beside her, and she looked, for the first time in perhaps years, entirely without armor. Not weak, just present, just exactly herself, unedited in a fluorescent-lit curtained bay that didn't care who she was outside it. "The man who treated me," she said, "before the ambulance. Can you tell anything, from what he did, about his background?" The doctor looked up from her tablet. "I can tell you that whoever it was almost certainly saved your life. The positioning alone, keeping you upright, the breathing cadence, without that, with the degree of laryngeal involvement we're seeing, you would have lost consciousness before the paramedics arrived." She paused. "Was it another physician?" Nadia looked at the curtain. Beyond it, the quiet machinery of a hospital moving through its night shift. The sound she'd never paid particular attention to before. The specific human infrastructure of people whose names she'd never learned doing work she'd never considered. "No," she said quietly. "He wasn't." She reached for her phone, opened a new message to Briseis Okafor, and stared at it for a long time before she knew what to say. The message she sent Bree was 4 words. "We need to talk." She put the phone face down on the hospital blanket and looked at the ceiling of the curtained bay, the standard issue acoustic tile, the fluorescent tube above it, the utterly indifferent infrastructure of a place designed for function rather than feeling. And she stayed there for a while, just breathing, because breathing was still something she was conscious of in a way she hadn't been this morning and suspected she would be for some time. Bree's response came in 11 minutes, not immediately. 11 minutes, which meant she'd seen the message, sat with it, and decided what she wanted to say before saying it. That was Bree. That had always been Bree. "I know," the message said. "I heard from him. I'm glad you're okay." A pause, indicated by the timestamp gap between messages. "I should have told you more about who he was before tonight. That's on me." Nadia read it twice. Then she typed, "Why didn't you?" The response took longer this time. Long enough that Nadia had accepted a cup of tea from a passing nurse. Small cup, cheap bag, the kind of tea that had no pretension about being anything other than hot and present, and taken 2 sips before the phone buzzed. "Because he would have hated it," Bree wrote. "He doesn't lead with it. He doesn't lead with any of it. If I'd told you he was a decorated combat medic with 8 years of forward trauma work before you met him, you'd have come in with an idea of him. And Callum doesn't fit inside other people's ideas of him. He's just himself. I thought that would be enough." Nadia set the phone down again. She thought about what she'd come in with instead. The assessment she'd made in the first 4 minutes. The blazer, the occupation, the specific arithmetic she'd done without examining it, adding up the visible columns and arriving at a conclusion she hadn't questioned because she'd never needed to question it before. She was good at reading people. She'd always been good at reading people. It was one of the things she privately considered a genuine skill rather than a conceit. She'd been wrong. Not partially wrong. Not wrong in some nuanced, context-dependent way she could trace back to incomplete information. Just wrong. Plainly, completely, in front of a restaurant full of witnesses who had watched her be wrong, and then watched the person she'd been wrong about hold her airway open until help arrived. The attending physician appeared at the curtain. "How are you feeling?" "Clearer," Nadia said. She meant it in more than one way and suspected the doctor heard both meanings and was too professional to acknowledge either. The next morning arrived, gray and quiet, the city doing what it did in mid-autumn, pulling the light back slightly, reminding everyone that brightness was borrowed. Callum was on shift by 6, third-floor surgical wing, and the corridors were in that particular early morning state of ordered calm before the day's full weight descended. He was working the far end of the wing, mopping in the long, unhurried strokes that covered ground efficiently without performance, when he heard footsteps behind him that didn't belong to the morning's usual rhythm. Too deliberate, too directed. He turned. Dr. Fenwick Lau was walking toward him in a suit that cost more than Callum's monthly rent, carrying 2 paper cups of coffee from the ground floor cart, and wearing the expression of a man who had made a decision and arrived to carry it out before he could reconsider it. He held out one of the cups. Callum looked at it for a moment. Then he leaned the mop against the wall and took it. They stood in the corridor, the consultant cardiologist and the janitor, and drank bad coffee in the particular silence of 2 people who had been through something together and were still working out what that meant. "I've been thinking about what you said last night," Lau began. "About your training, the forward postings." He paused. "I've also been thinking about what I said, what I told you outside the restaurant. You don't need to. I want to." Lau said it quietly but firmly, the way men say things when they've rehearsed them enough to mean them. "I've worked in this hospital for 19 years. I've walked past the janitorial staff approximately—" He stopped, Something shifted in his face. I've walked past a great many people without asking who they were, what they'd done, what they knew. He looked at Callum steadily. That was a failure of curiosity I'm not particularly proud of this morning. Callum held the coffee cup in both hands. The warmth of it was specific and good. I appreciate that, he said. The paramedic who took the handoff last night, Lau continued. She filed a commendation report this morning for an unnamed first responder at Osteria Rain. He paused. I gave them your name. I hope that was all right. Callum looked at him. Outside the window, at the end of the corridor, the gray morning was doing its quiet, unhurried work. Yeah, he said. That's all right. The commendation sat somewhere in a system Callum had no access to and no particular interest in accessing. He knew how institutions processed things, the forms, the filing, the slow, bureaucratic digestion of events that had been vivid and immediate and were now becoming paperwork. He'd watched it happen in the army. He'd watched it happen here. The form would move through channels. Someone would sign it. It would mean something to whoever needed it to mean something, and it would change nothing about Tuesday morning on the third-floor surgical wing. He finished his shift at 2. Collected. Mara from school at 3:15, which required a bus and a 7-minute walk, and the specific internal recalibration that happened every time he saw her. The way his whole nervous system, still carrying the residue of whatever the day had been, simply reorganized itself around her presence. She was wearing her blue coat and carrying a drawing she'd done in class that she wanted to show him immediately, before they'd even left the school gate. It was a picture of a man and a small girl standing in front of what appeared to be a very large bird. That's us, she said, pointing to the figures. And that's an eagle, because eagles can see things from far away that other animals can't see. He looked at the drawing, at the careful, earnest figures his daughter had made, the tall one and the small one, side by side, the enormous bird above them rendered in blue crayon with complete confidence in its proportions. Why an eagle? He asked. She looked up at him with the expression she reserved for questions she considered obvious. Because that's what you're like, Baba, she said, and took his hand, and they walked to the bus stop. He thought about that the whole way home. The card arrived 4 days after the incident, not electronically, a physical card, cream envelope, his name written on the front in handwriting that was precise and slightly angular, the handwriting of someone who thought carefully about how things were presented. Bree had passed it to him at the end of her shift, pressing it into his hand with an expression that was trying very hard to be neutral and not entirely succeeding. She asked me to give it to you directly, Bree said. She said she didn't want it to go through anyone official. She said, and I'm quoting, that it wasn't that kind of apology. He'd put it in his jacket pocket and waited until Mara was asleep. He sat in the kitchen with a cup of tea and opened it. The card was plain inside. No printed sentiment, just the cream, interior, and her handwriting, which continued with the same careful precision as the envelope. Mr. Reyes, I've started this several times and haven't found a version that sounds like enough, so I'm going to stop looking for enough and just say what's true. What I said at dinner, the comment, the way I said it, what I intended by it, was wrong. Not impolite, not poorly timed, wrong. I made an assessment of your worth based on information that had nothing to do with your worth, and I did it publicly, and I did it without a moment's consideration of what that cost you. You saved my life 20 minutes later. I'm not writing to you because of that. I want to be clear about this. The apology isn't a function of the outcome. I've thought about it carefully, and I'm certain what I did was wrong before you opened that kit. It would have been wrong if nothing had happened. The outcome doesn't create the debt. The behavior did. If you have no interest in hearing from me again, I understand that completely, and I won't reach out further. But if you'd be willing to meet, not because you owe me anything, because you don't, I would like the chance to say this to your face. N. Voss. He read it twice. The tea went slightly cold while he was reading it the second time. He thought about Mara's drawing, the tall figure and the small one, the eagle above them, looking at things from far away that other animals couldn't see. He thought about Sana, which he did most nights at this hour, not with the sharp, destabilizing grief of the early years, but with the quieter ache of someone who has learned to carry a thing and carry it well. He thought about what she would have made of all this: the date, the kit, the restaurant, the card on the kitchen table, and he could hear, with the specific clarity that 3 years of practice had given him, exactly what she would have said. So, call her then. He folded the card back into the envelope. He didn't call that night. But he put the envelope on the counter instead of in the drawer. The envelope stayed on the counter for 2 days. Not because he was uncertain, or not only because of that. More because he'd learned, over the years, to give important decisions the time they actually needed rather than the time anxiety suggested. Rushing toward things and rushing away from them were both forms of avoidance dressed in different clothes. He'd learned that slowly, the hard way, in the particular school of losing someone and having to reconstruct a life from the remaining materials. On the third morning, Mara saw the envelope while she was eating breakfast. "Is that the lady from the date?" she asked, with the forensic casualness of a 7-year-old who notices everything and has decided to deploy the information now. He looked at her. "Bree told you about the date." "Bree tells me things." She stirred her cereal. "Is she nice?" He thought about the restaurant, the wine glass, the comment, the hand on the stretcher rail, white-knuckled and determined, the card with its careful handwriting and its refusal to hide behind the outcome as justification. The apology isn't a function of the outcome. "She's complicated," he said. Mara considered this with the seriousness it deserved. "Complicated people are usually more interesting," she said, and finished her breakfast, and that was apparently that. He called that afternoon. She answered on the second ring, which told him she'd been waiting, and the fact that she'd been waiting told him something about how the last several days had been for her that no amount of careful language would have communicated as clearly. They agreed to meet. Somewhere quieter than Osteria Rain, that felt, without either of them needing to say it, like an obvious condition. A small cafe on Aldrin Street that Callum knew from Saturday mornings with Mara, that had good tea and the kind of ambient noise that made conversation feel private without being isolated. He arrived first, ordered tea, sat with his hands around the cup, and waited. She came in looking different from the restaurant. Same precision, same quality of attention, but something in her carriage had shifted. Some invisible infrastructure that had been holding a particular shape for a long time had been quietly reorganized. She was wearing a coat he suspected cost a significant amount of money and carrying a bag that almost certainly did, and none of that had changed, but the way she moved through the door was less armored than he remembered. She sat down across from him, looked at him directly. Thank you for calling, she said. Thank you for the card, he said. It was honest. I tried to make it honest. She paused. I'm better at honesty in writing than in person. I'm working on that. Something in him recognized the specific difficulty of that admission. Not the content of it, but the act of making it, unprompted, at the beginning of a conversation rather than at the end of one. He'd known people who'd spent entire relationships never arriving at that sentence. Ask me something, he said. She looked at him. What? You wrote that you wanted to meet. That means there's something you want to understand, so ask it. She was quiet for a moment. Outside, the city moved past the cafe window in its ordinary, indifferent way. People and vehicles and the low, gray sky doing what it did in this season. Then she said, What was it like? 8 years, forward postings, coming home to all of this. She didn't gesture at the cafe or the street. She gestured, somehow, at the whole shape of his current life. I want to understand the distance between those two things. If you're willing to talk about it. He looked at his tea, at the window, at the woman across from him who had, in the space of a week, been the source of the sharpest social injury he'd sustained in years, and then written him the most honest letter he'd received in longer than that. He thought about Mara, who was with Bree, who had her inhaler, who was fine. He thought about Sana. He thought about an eagle drawn in blue crayon, seeing things from far away that other animals couldn't see. And Callum, who had not talked about it, really talked about it, in 3 years, opened his mouth and slowly, carefully began. Some people spend their whole lives being looked past. Not because they're invisible, but because the people looking never bothered to see. This story was for all of them. Subscribe and don't miss our next story. The billionaire's daughter fired the quiet janitor. Then her private jet lost power over the ocean. Trust me, you'll feel it. And tell me in the comments, what injustice should we tackle next?